Hey everyone, welcome to the Tech in EdTech podcast. We are very happy to bring you back here today for our latest episode on leveraging global competency centers for designing, building, and supporting digital learning products and platforms. The question to answer here is: are global competency centers a good strategic fit for EdTech business? Today I have a guest with us, Ashish Malhotra. Ashish is an organization design specialist with an emphasis on leveraging global human capital. His scope includes design and transformation of talent and processes within business, technology, and operations. Throughout his 30 years career, he has worked with and advised companies across industries, large and small, and across functions such as finance, HR, technology, engineering, customer care, and procurement. He has led the global resource strategy as a buyer, seller, and an advisor in an executive capacity and for several Fortune 500 companies. Welcome, Ashish, to our podcast, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me here today, Acky.
Ashish, you and I first interacted around 2009 when you were at Citibank. I recall you were in the midst of a major transformation and migration project. I'd like you to give our listeners some color to the experience that you were going through during that project and journey till now.
Sure thing. And yes, indeed, even though it seems like yesterday, it was more than a decade ago. But if you recall, the financial industry had taken a turn for the worse around in 2007. And many large and reputed firms were in trouble and being liquidated or sold off. Citi was also in similar trouble, just like the others, and TARP had advised Citigroup to cut costs. It is important to note, I think, that Citi is one of the first companies to embrace outsourcing and offshoring and these global competency centers long before the term was coined. And in fact, over the years has given birth to many offshore companies such as Polaris and iFlex, which is now acquired by Oracle, by building and then monetizing such GCCs. So during my time and under the leadership of a dear friend from a prior life, I was the program manager for the Global Technology Resource Strategy, or the GTRS program within Citigroup. We had built technology centers of excellence in almost 10 countries. We had established centers in 10 countries. And Citi had over 50,000 global technology and engineering resources globally. One of the first things that I did was we executed an RFP to pick about 10 to 12 preferred providers to the GTRS program. During the 5 years, we successfully took out about $500 million in costs on a run rate basis. Now, subsequently, I worked at Time Warner. I joined an advisory firm at Alex Partners, and I've spent the rest of my career focused on this particular topic, as you've stated in the introduction, finally.
Wow, the scale. And who would forget the financial crisis that we all were going through Wall Street? Main Street, and the government bailouts as well. To be able to drive such a large scale transformation and migration programs at Citi, you must have faced a lot of challenges, particularly aligning different stakeholders to agree to such a scale transformation and migration, isn't it?
So, Acky, Citi had done this several times before, good amount of experience, leadership alignment, having achieved successes in establishing these destination centers. And then the fact that the regulators were so keen in seeing these companies drive out costs was an additive kind of impetus to get those changes and transformations done. So we did have the benefit of alignment. How we did that, though, is by maturing existing destination centers that already existed at Citigroup, as that's what we called them back then, around the areas of their excellence adjacencies. We built a few new centers, such as Citi Enclave, to do some critical work that needed to be internal. Back in those days, due to regulatory scrutiny, things like risk management and regulatory compliance required almost their own excellence centers. And like I talked about, since Citi had built so many centers and had gone through cycles of even monetizing them, we were able to monetize a few of our global competency centers, such as Cytos, which we transferred to Wipro, one of our technology partners back then. I think if I, think about alignment, I think the critical alignment that we needed and we achieved was that rather than trying to do it all by yourself in a DIY model and building your own brick and mortar, we were able to build many of these centers with the help of our provider partners in institutional clients group as well as in consumer and private banking.
So, Ashish, you said two things. Whenever I'm thinking of large scale transformation and migration, I'm thinking everything else is stable and I'm in control. However, in your case, the crisis put everyone behind this transformation and migration. So you got an alignment internally behind this crisis. That's an interesting point. In education also, we are right now going through massive disruption. So I think we're going to come and talk about that a little bit later. The two things that I want to ask you, or rather reiterate. One is that when the clients are setting up global competency center, often the thinking is to set it up on their own. But you seem to recommend a partner strategy to set up a global competency center. The other one was even more interesting, which is to monetize an existing global competency center. So it's a two-way street. If you can elaborate that a little bit, that would be great.
Sure. So let's start with the first topical area, which is utilizing good providers and partners to help you set up your centers. Essentially, to set up these centers, it takes a longer period of time if you do it on your own, and it also takes a little bit of seed capital and investment upfront. The benefit of doing this with the partners is that the partners will often at times make that initial investment, freeing you from that capital, initial capital that is needed to seed such GCCs. And because they have the expertise in standing these up for multiple clients and for themselves in various cities and locations, not just in one country, but across multiple countries around the world, you have the added advantage of them having the hiring practices, the training practices, setting up the standard operating procedures. All those, things are a pretty well-oiled machinery, so to speak, that the partner brings to the table. Now, many of these partners might work on a BOT model, which is, they'll build it for you, they'll operate it for you for 3 or 5 years to amortize and extract the value for themselves of the initial investment they made on your behalf. And then they may transfer it back to you. And I will confess that usually the T in that BOT scarcely happens. Why? Because clients generally are, if you're happy with the arrangement and if everything is running well in 3 to 5 years, there's absolutely no reason to disrupt it. Taking that second example or the second part of your question, which was around monetizing these assets, indeed so, right? So not only do the banks do that, other industries have very good examples of monetizing established centers because either they're looking to actually move out of those practices because it's not their core, or there are several other reasons why one may monetize established centers. And if you think about a 5 to 7 year journey, if you got the value that comes from from wage arbitrage and drove the efficiencies, if you got the value from quality management systems, if you access new talent pools and ecosystems and built out new products and gain new technological know-how, 5, 7, 8 years later, you might want to restart that cycle and hive off the established one. From a point of a provider, they're willing to, make that investment in your established center and acquire it from you, largely because they're looking to either get into that new business, learn new skills, or enter a new industry segment. And so it is a win-win for both parties.
Absolutely. It's interesting. So this is almost like a cherry on the top because within 5 to 7 years, you created an asset that has got a value. You also got the benefit of labor arbitrage during these 5 to 7 years, and you should be able to extract some value of this asset by giving it to a partner. That's fantastic.
Absolutely. So, in our example that I talked about previously, we monetized an asset which was an established GCC, and we handed it to one of our preferred providers. And the flip side of that contract and sale was that we'd continue to use the benefit of those services at those same prices, moderately adjusted for cost of living for the next 5 years also.
Yeah, that's actually really cool. And what would be the driver for you to monetize the asset after 5 to 7 years? You said that particular GCC may not be core anymore, but when you started the journey, it was core, isn't it?
Right. I mean, so the focus of organizations, I think, changes for their business cycles and competitive and environmental, changes, right? So, at some point, you might have, for reasons of saving cost, I make an example up for illustration, taken your, accounts payables and accounts receivables, your P2P, you order cash processes, and done some outsourcing with it. You extracted a lot of savings, you matured the standard operating procedures, and now 5, 7 years later, it's become a hum-ho activity that seems to run well on its own. And to you, as long as it continues to run well on its own without too much oversight and at around the same price points, you're pretty happy. But there may be a provider out there who's willing to pay a premium for that well established set of practices because they can leverage it to sell the same services now within the industry or in adjacencies to several other clients, which was never the client's original intent. So that creates a secondary arbitrage of sorts in that we took 5, 7 years, we established something that runs really well. We're not looking to sell that as a service because that's really not our core business to other clients. But there is a party that is interested in that well established, well oiled machinery because they can make more money off it, taking it to market as a product and as a service. And they're willing to pay a premium for that. So that's the arbitrage that you're looking to capture in that monetizing activity.
Great. So something that was core in the beginning may not be core after 5 or 7 years because your organization priorities have changed, and the initial need to do the governance and review mechanism may no longer be required because this uh, GCC is now working in auto mode. You have set all the processes, and it is okay for a third party partner vendor to run it in a vendor supplier mode. Am I correct?
Absolutely. So if you take an example, right, and if you think about Cognizant, it was Dun and Bradstreet's, and the term we're using now, Global Competency Center, right? And it was spun off, made into an independent entity. And today, Cognizant's market cap is greater than Dun and Bradstreet's, right? So there is a heck of a lot of value in that asset that was created by Dun and Bradstreet by taking some of their work offshore and creating this entity as a global competency center, which could only be realized if it was spun outside of Dun and Bradstreet and made into an independent entity that was able to sell that excellence that they had established over the years to many, 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 many more clients. And so, if you think about Cognizant today, it's a tier one company that services almost every facet and every industry of our Fortune 500 spectrum.
So, let's now come to the hypothesis of this podcast, right? And for our listeners, it looks like the education publishing houses and ed tech companies, particularly here in the US, are now coming around to leverage global talent pool by setting up a global competency center in a country like India. India obviously is rich in engineering talent, and there's certainly potential to save 50-60% of the cost. If you can help our listeners understand how this strategy of setting up GCC be a game changer for education publishing houses, edtech companies, and even universities, that would be fantastic if you could take us through that.
So I think that's an excellent question. And if you'd allow me, I want to first start at the fact that the appetite for education in a country like India is very high. So when I think about EdTech, any strategy to do engineering work in India for EdTech companies, I would imagine needs to have in the narrative the access to the market that India is for advanced studies. If not immediately, then down the road as part of a considered strategy. I think you would lead not so much with the savings, and it is true, as you pointed out, that you should be able to see 40, 50, 60% savings. But like many sectors that have gone before, tech, manufacturing, and financial services, right? I think many of these now pursue these strategies to gain scarce skills, access talent pools, access ecosystems, which they can leverage in these centers, and be on the front, on the leading edge of technology by doing work in such destinations.
Let me reiterate, one of the biggest drivers for setting up GCC is cost savings. But your point of view is that that should not be the driver alone. You want our listeners to look at the holistic value proposition. And in thinking of location like India, there are many other factors that play up besides cost savings. Time zone, infrastructure, political risk, and quality of talent, etc. We'll come to all of this a little bit later. One of the overarching trend in education business is, the swings that we see in the investments. 2020-21, we saw a huge upswing in investments, and today we see some kind of ebb in investments. So the investments have contracted, funding has contracted. However, the education sector, whether it is universities or whether it is tech companies or publishing houses, they have to continue to innovate. They have to continue to march forward, and for that, they have to launch new initiatives, new products, and they need investments for that. They need funding for that. And one of the best ways to do that is to look at your internal spend on legacy technologies, existing infrastructures, and find avenues for cost savings. In that context, if you can elaborate for our listeners, given your experience in setting up GCC and also setting up the business cases for GCC, what is your advice for our listeners?
So it's a fantastic question, Aki, because that is precisely the leading set of objectives and aspirations that many of the predecessors and mature companies that have done this for several iterations go in to GCCs now. It's a luxury to have had funding in this industry segment, which now seems to be drying up. There are many industries that never had such IPO, PE, VC based funding and had to make accommodations and tighten their belt. Right? I personally helped firms migrate their spending from the run perform activities to the build transform activities because budgets are finite. And in fact, in some cases, budgets are shrinking. So you've got to be able to look at all the things that you utilize just to run and operate, and drive efficiencies and excellence in those things, so that you can extract the spending power out of those activities and reutilize them as investment in your build transform activities.
So it's all about portfolio management, I guess.
Absolutely right. And so, imagining for for the edtech companies, the market pressure to continue to invest in new initiatives to stay relevant is going to continue to mean to drive these sorts of efficiencies. GCCs are a great enabler of that. Right? They're not just access to new technologies and new skill sets. GCCs, just by virtue of the fact that there is a wage arbitrage play, and I've cautioned before that that shouldn't be a primary reasoning why you embrace the GCC model, but that is going to be a benefit that is going to fall in place as soon as your GCC is established and is fully operational.
And let me add, I think AI particularly is going to be a very big disruptive force. I think everybody's talked about it. We all understand it. And, when we are talking about its impact on learning products and platforms, it is really big. I also want to add that several companies that we interact with, and some of our listeners will agree with me, is that AI is not just for they're not looking talent AI talent just for the learning products and platforms that they're building for their customers, but they're also incorporating AI to transform their organizations, the corporate functions like HR, legal, accounting. I think therefore the demand for AI talent will be huge, and this will require them to overall look at the demand supply gap in their organization for AI talent. Besides the technologies, growth that they may have at their end, the general infrastructure technology growth that they may have. I like the concept of run perform activities versus build transform activities. Thank you for that. I want to move to another related topic. Let's say we are talking to our clients and helping them understand the process of setting up GCC. Is there a particular way or particular guideline process by which you can help them create a business case?
Well, so there are two approaches, as we I think briefly touched on. You could set these up as a DIY, self-owned and run GCCs. In which case, the capital investment, the cycle to stand it up is a little longer. The capital investment is a little higher, and the business case would have to factor that in. And then you would look upon, the benefit side of that business case and the value propositions that you're looking to actually extract from your GCC. Um, if the client is not able to raise the capital that might be needed for the initial seeding of the GCC, then an alternative way to start these is through partners, as we briefly touched on. And they invest in the GCC. They bring all the excellence to the table to stand it up and get it operational, and at some point might consider transferring it back to you. Um, so in addition to those elements, there are a couple of other typical considerations that I want to highlight that are important in embarking on this journey. Right, stakeholders need to be aligned. The C-suite specifically, there are certain cultural issues. Being ready for change, because this is transformative, and not only is it transformative in the way operations would happen, it's transformative in the morale, things like that. And so that readiness for change. Not setting it up. I mean, this program like this, if done right, does not need to be set up as a chop shop. Right? There's a really nice method to this madness where you're able to transform and reskill some of the resources to focus on those growth initiatives that we talked about, and as they migrate away from some of the routine run activities. Um, you also probably want to pay attention. You touched on the narrative, which is very important, but you want to probably pay attention to some of the other objectives that you're looking to actually achieve through this process. Right? These objectives might be investment in new platforms, and so it creates a kind of a sort of double bubble, because you do have your existing platforms and existing product suite that you're taking to the market that requires continued upkeep, and you're looking to make that investment in these new platforms. So driving the efficiencies in the existing platforms while still keeping the lights on is again a place where the GCCs can come into place, and then utilizing those centers of excellence to build out your new platforms can perhaps reduce the burden of that double bubble. I don't think there is a cookie cutter approach to this. I think the most important thing is that it should align to the leadership's aspirations and their sense of timeline. Some leaders might need this more urgently, and that might mean you go with a provider partner option, whereas some clients might have a greater luxury to pursue this path have a greater concern for intellectual property, for example, or have maybe prior established presence or offices in some of these destination areas, or a desire to access those markets with their own products. So there's a couple of those considerations that come into play to really articulate what is the right, I guess, approach to GCCs for each client one at a time.
So, Ashish, that was a great perspective. So, it's not just the cost savings that we're talking about when you're building a business case, though that might be the initial driver for one of my customers to think about going and setting up a GCC, but it's also the holistic view of the business, alignment of the leadership, etc. I want to just zone into one particular attribute in this transformation migration journey when you're setting up GCC, which is people. At the end of the day, you're talking about change management with people on the ground here in stateside, and then also as you're building up the GCC talent pool. Let's say this is in India, then you want to be able to ensure that the people are coming together. Do you have any, maybe with examples, illustrate to our listeners, what are the pitfalls you should avoid, and what practices you should bring into play?
Sure. So, a couple of years ago, or decades ago when this all began, the types of challenges people spoke about that were people or cultural types of issues were around communications, around language, accent, time zones, teaming, so to speak, interactions, right? I think the segment of creating GCCs or working with providers, and not just in India, but in Philippines and Eastern Europe and Brazil, Chile, Argentina, all over the world, has matured so much that I don't think those are anymore the pertinent issues and concerns, right? I think what is now more important as the labor pools have matured themselves in places like India is the sense of identity. It is the ability to be able to contribute to thought leadership, is having a feeling of that participation, much like the sending side and the receiving side being part of the same cohesive unit. There used to be, in fact, almost invariably, all the GCCs set up in the past were cost centers. Many of them today are profit centers. The reporting lines are no longer in region for region, in country for country. The reporting lines now are actually essentially global for many of these GCCs, right? So I think the empathy that a leadership must have for both the sending side, because they're going through their own sets of concerns and issues to deal with, and the receiving side, which is being brought in as new members of the team, is absolutely crucial in driving success. And then, to your point, in formulating cohesive work units that are all focused on the same set of objectives, mission, vision, and charters.
That's a good point. I like the concept of receiving side and sending side and bringing them together to create one team. I have one more question. Would you consider putting your full-time employees into the GCC, which is located in a place like India or Brazil, offshore?
So, in some cases, it's unavoidable, but the approach that is more prevalent is often, and I'll come back to the statement I just made, but the approach that is more prevalent is usually the providers have local account managers that work with clients on the state side, right? So you have local account managers, local delivery experts who work with the clients' teams to understand what is being built and then transfer that knowledge and manage the folks on the other side. And if you have your own GCC, I'm probably one of the few voices that does not really encourage sending expatriate positions. I think frequent business travel is adequate. But there are companies that have had success with, planting their own resources in the GCCs, whether they were, self-owned brick and mortar operations or they were, at provider facilities. The risk of sending one or two or three expatriate positions sometimes in such situations is a sense of isolation. So the alternative approaches, of course, could be short-term business travel, multiplicity of it, bringing people from there here sometimes, sending some people from here to there. It creates a great opportunity for teaming, as well as maybe perhaps hiring. And this is the rare example I was talking about earlier that I started with. Sometimes hiring locally in those markets, if you have an office, where those people become not only your subject matter experts, but they're also boots on the ground for governance activities and just general oversight of operations.
Often, when we talk about setting up a GCC in a country like Argentina, Brazil, or India, political risk comes up as a big topic. Could you, for our listeners, elaborate a little more on this topic?
So when you're setting up a GCC, one of the first things you're likely to do is a location assessment. And typically, when you're doing a location assessment, there's a well-established set of criteria to do these, and I call that the STRIPE model. It's social, political, regulatory, infrastructure, talent and technology, and then economy and environment. Right, and so when you think about doing a location assessment, you're going to look for those type of regulatory risks. As part of that assessment before you determine the destination you want to be at. What I will point out is you're actually going in for only one reason and one reason only, which is access to technology and talent at the right price. Right? Some of these other considerations are what I deem as adversity considerations. They are almost like threshold checkpoints. You want to confirm that the environment is not adverse to your aspirations and your objectives in any manner, right? A good example, of these days, unfortunately, is you might reconsider Ukraine as a destination, even though Ukraine probably has some of the best technical skills, and that might have been a different uh, uh, outcome just 2 years ago. So you want to see the absence of certain adversity considerations. You want to make sure there's an adequate amount of infrastructure to support your aspirations. But then at the end of the day, you're looking for curriculum in the schools, the output of local universities. You're looking for your peer community. How many other prevalent mega technology companies operate in the same place that might uh, be able to poach your employees once you have them up and ready. So that's all around the technology, around the talent, and around the price points and access that you have to these things.
Very well. I think I understand that remaining focused rather on a higher goal is much more important than getting stuck with some of these adverse factors, as you call it. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, look, so much of it has already been done by so many companies within so many industries that there is an adequate amount of precedence. Whether it's from a regulatory point of view, are there issues? I'm sure they are. Can they be handled? Of course they can. Otherwise, you won't have so many centers around the globe. So that's why I call them the adversity factors, is you're actually not factoring them into your evaluation other than confirming that none of these things are adverse to your aspirations for some reason, for one reason or another. And the absence of such factors as hindrances to your mission is really what you're looking for.
And thank you for that. I do want my listeners to know that Ashish advises several Fortune 500 companies on their transformation and migration programs, as well as helps them set up GCCs. He has written up a global workforce strategy white paper, and also he has contributed to a Sprite framework. If you'd like to connect with Ashish separately, we can help you with that. So Ashish, going back to the question on regulatory considerations for both US and a target country like India, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So let's do the simpler one first, right? In the US, the regulatory regime that would matter is restraints based. So, for example, if you're looking to do finance work, outsourcing in the finance work, whether it's with a GCC or a partner, you have to pay attention to a SACE 18, SOC 1, SOC 2 kind of audit for compliance purposes. These are published rules by AICPA and generally available in the public domain. Data privacy comes into play. Again, it's a set of constraints that you have to adhere to. In the European regime, the GDPR data privacy rules are a little bit stricter than the US, and most providers today adhere to GDPR, get themselves certified by the International Standards Organization on ISO 27001, 27001, things like that. If you were doing medical work, HIPAA compliance comes into play here in the US. And then there are, of course, certain local governments, certain states, and certain federal agencies that have their own stipulations. So, for example, you cannot do any work for DoD or VA in an offshore location. So the point about regulation and such regulatory compliance that I want to make is all of this, while it's frightening, is available in the public domain. It's well published, it's well understood, and it has been implemented in many, many cases prior to today. Right now, when you go to the local side, the receiving side of your GCC or provider, the first thing to pay attention to is the incentives, right? Because a lot of these governments will actually incentivize clients like the ones that you are speaking of to bring new jobs to that market. So those incentives, the tax benefits, these things matter, and that's important to pay attention to. But now you have it all stood up, and you want to actually think about what are some of the other regulatory matters that you should pay attention to. So local laws, for example, is an important consideration. How long does it take to enforce a contract in at your destination? How many taxation events are there within a year? Will that amount to too much overhead for your organization? But again, that's all part of that location assessment that you did up front and these were the kinds of things that would have served as the threshold adversity factors for you, where you said, oh, I just don't even like that. I'm not going to go to that destination.
Yeah, Ashish, I agree with you on that point. I think it's a good way to think about, what US wants versus what the destination country like India wants. And I think your Sprite framework helps us figure these things out even before you decide where you want to go and set up the GCC. And one way to maybe mitigate against, meeting all the regulatory requirements of a destination country is to perhaps leverage partners. And I think you talked about that earlier in this podcast.
So as a practitioner, I've leaned a lot on partners throughout my career. I think partners bring a lot to the table. They bring established processes, hiring practices, training practices. They can standardize operating procedures. They bring in a variety of different skills that they have access to. They have the know-how of the local markets. They have programs at universities where they go hiring from. So those are all benefits that can come to the table. Most importantly, what partners bring to the table is this expediency in terms of time to market to get it all set up. Right? So that's very important. There are a couple of things that you still cannot take your eye off of, whether it was your own center or you're working with the partners. And we spoke briefly about this before. One is having the empathy, whether that person, empathy for not only your resources here in stateside, but even the team that you're now putting together. Whether that resource is your own employee at that destination or your partner's employee, having them feel like they're part of your team is definitely an advantage. I obviously would encourage you to stay completely clear of indulging in any form of performance appraisal or performance management when it's your partner setting it up for you. But giving your people, if they're your people, the opportunity to grow and things like that, those things become very pertinent in terms of setting up sustainable GCCs.
A lot of education publishing houses at tech companies already work with vendor suppliers who are located in a place like India. Some of my listeners might be thinking that I already have a vendor partner, I already have an MSA, I got some arrangement to outsource my work to that destination. And so I'm already doing some kind of leverage on cost and leveraging global talent pool. So, what's the difference when I'm thinking of setting up a GCC versus leveraging partners in a regular supplier vendor model?
Well, there are firms, like if you were setting up your own GCC by yourself, right, you are likely to find new providers that have expertise in finding you, for example, good real estate, um, help you build an office space, that is assimilated to your culture. I remember when we created the office space for about 1,000 seater called the City Enclave for Citibank. One of the things that I was really after was to have it be a LEEDs Gold or Platinum facility. We ended up creating a LEEDs Platinum facility, which was first of its kind in Pune and among the very few in India. And it created a tremendous amount of motivation for our employees because it was unique and it kind of showed how much attention was paid to things that matter to them. So, uh, so you'll end up engaging a few other providers in addition to the providers you have that specialize in these unique uh, things that become necessary when you're setting up your own brick and mortar. You're not going to go look for electricians and plumbers, certainly not at that level. But the likes of CBRE and JLL all participate in a place like India rather well. They know the office space and the office infrastructure really well, and so you certainly might actually find, a need to hire one of those types of firms to do your real estate search. But I do think that sometimes the clients do not challenge their preferred providers to the degree that their preferred providers can be challenged to. So, so there is an opportunity there to actually ask of your preferred providers, if you have them already, on what else they can bring to the table to help you build up your own facility. Now, you just have to be a little careful because the messaging over there automatically spells cannibalization of the revenue that they're hoping to make with you as a client. So you just have to be a little bit, careful about how that message goes down. If that was already previously understood that that was the intent, that's excellent. If it isn't, sometimes what you might get is you might get that preferred provider get a little jittery, and they'll start to, over a course of short duration, move away some of their better people to other clients just for their own risk management purposes. I think it's a simple, when I think about global resource strategy and workforce, and I hate saying this about my own body of work, I think it's a simple matter. I just think it's costly if you get it wrong, but it's simple to execute as long as you have good vision, and your narrative properly documents your aspirations.
Ashish, I think you've done it so many times, so it's easy for you to say it's simple. However, there are many of my listeners here who may be first timers when it comes to thinking about setting a global competency center. So, on their behalf, let me ask you: do you have a step-by-step checklist? Do you have a model that they can adopt when they're thinking of GCC? You mentioned something about Sprite framework, so maybe that could be a good starting point. Uh, Quick question: what is the timeline that they should budget? When they think of setting up a GCC, and what's the minimum scale that they should think about?
So I've set up 50 people shops and floors for that took 6 months. Um, And I've also set up 1,000 seaters that were stood up all in a year. Right? And again, the pace is more determined by the ability to consume such change and transformation internally at the client side. And you want to pace it such that it's not disruptive. It's additive. It shouldn't be disruptive to the point that it's taking away from how business is conducted. But that aside, I mean, I think 6 to 9 months is a very good time frame to have your own operational center where you begin the clock at the point where you've completed your business case. The process of creating a business case could be another month or so prior to that. But that aside, I think as we've talked about before, the providers can do it faster.
So you mentioned 50 people to 1,000 people. Is there a timeline for that scale for a GCC?
Sure,
So I'm thinking of 3 to 5 years, maybe. What's the advice on the scale?
sure, absolutely, and that's a very good question. So when you create your own center, there are certain overhead costs that you're just going to incur. There are other services that come into play, the cafeteria and things like that, cleaning services. So these are all overheads. They're no different than other corporate overheads that you would sustain in any other place. And but those overheads have to be amortized because these are the non-billable overheads. They have to be amortized over the billable resource pool, right? So the billable resource pool over here is the people who are actually productively doing the engineering work or whatever work you wanted your GCC to do. I think that number for proper amortization of those overheads is around that 200 mark. That if you're smaller than 200, you're likely to have, are there GCCs that have been established with less than that? Sure. But you've rented space rather than built out your space in these ready-to-use offices. Those costs are a little higher. You paid for pre-fitment of infrastructure and computing infrastructure and things like that. Um, so so that's where the threshold is. Um, if you think you're going to grow to that, it's worthwhile perhaps to make that investment. But if your approach to the GCC space is to never be larger than 100, 150 people, then perhaps it is the right model to consider a provider partner model. If you're going to be significantly larger than that, then you might even consider a hybrid because then you buy some assets, some resources on a fixed cost basis because they're your employees at that destination. And you still have a hybrid model with a provider where some of the resources, some of the skills, some of the technologies that keep changing so frequently for us these days, are all on a variable cost structure because they can be brought in and off, they can be onboarded and offboarded based on your need. So again, the answer is not a cookie cutter answer and not probably as straightforward as you might have wanted it to be, Aki. But there is a threshold, and I think it all comes back to the client aspirations and how much needs to be achieved at what pace.
And thank you for that. Yeah, I think I agree with you that it is not a cookie cutter model. And which is also probably why I think customers who are trying to go and set up a GCC first time should take advice and check with other companies of similar size who have set up GCC and learn from their experience. Earlier, you mentioned about looking at GCC not just as a cost center, but as a profit center. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so a lot of GCCs that were set up as cost centers created a nuanced friction, so to speak, with headquarters and demand managers back home, right? In the sense, why are these costs high? Why is this additional investment needed in this GCC? Since there wasn't any direct costing, a lot of the costs were allocated based on either headcount being utilized by, let's say, the finance department, and you use 20 people, and HR uses 10 people, and so all the overheads are being, allocated in some manner that not everybody agreed to. Many of the newer GCCs are established as profit centers where they have a bill rate, and rightfully so. Their bill rate should be lower than a market rate by about 15 to 20%, because if you're working with a provider, you'd be paying for their 15 to 20% margin over and beyond all their uh, costs per resource that they were putting and deploying on your team. So that is a fair benchmark, but then you have a bill rate. Now that gives the GCC a sense of freedom to drive efficiencies and perhaps make investments in local technologies and local exploration, with, of course, the approvals of the area and functional leaders back at corporate. The other aspect of profit center, which is very, very unique and rather new and being used by a few of the really sharp companies, is where the geography is not a considered factor at all. So you have an administrator who has a GCC in a place like India, and that GCC has 1,000 people, for example. 200 of them are in finance, 100 of them report to HR, 400 in technology. Well, the lines of reporting of all these people is to various directors, VPs, SVPs globally, wherever they are, right? So there is no, so the only role that this GCC lead is providing is the role of an administrator of these 1,000, people in India, and each one of these functions is behaving like its own cost or profit center, as described by the parent company. However, there may be a business that the local party in India, the local teams in India, are globally responsible for, right? So a good example, which I think is still current, is NetApp's storage business is run by the GCC head in India globally. So the people in Boston, the people in Amsterdam, actually report to this gentleman who's based out of India, who provides administrative oversight of the entire Indian operation, but is responsible for the global P&L of the entire storage business. Right. So that's a very unique an advanced way of thinking, but it's exciting in that now you have created parity among your global teams, no matter where geographically they are. They are equivalent in terms of participating in thought leadership. They're equivalent in participating in delivery of product and services, and they're equivalent in terms of how their performance is measured at the end of the year, and they're therefore rewarded, even though moderated by local cost of living type of adjustments.
That's a great example. Thank you for that. So you're also thinking about your talent pool and giving them a seat at the table. The importance of making them feel like they've been brought into the organization to deliver value as opposed to just doing mundane work. Great point.
So that approach of I want to give my mundane, low in the trenches work to this offshore team, and I want to keep all the exciting stuff here, really worked well 15, 20, 25 years ago. The labor pool today in places, especially these mature destinations like Philippines and India, and the amount of market that exists for this labor pool to jump to, right? The amount of opportunity that exists is so high that none of them are excited to do the mundane work unless it is no different as a percentage of their total work as it would be anywhere else, right? So I got to do certain reports. I've got to do certain, things, which is no different than anybody else. But they're all now participating in the value creation and the value proposition. And that equivalency is what excites them. That's what drives the retention levers in being able to keep your resources for a long time. If you consider doing only the mundane work in these destinations, well, then you become the training ground where you teach the basic skills, and then somebody for just a margin more is able to poach upon them and take them away from your team. And so then you have the high turnover. You're in double digit, maybe even perhaps over 20% turnover in a destination like India. And that's because your staff is only there for a brief period of time to learn a few skills and then move on. So it's important to actually factor that into the type of work and the type of participation you're looking from these teams in your core product and services suite.
And my hope is that all the mundane work should go away thanks to AI. Uh, Repetitive, boring work should be able to delegate it to that, and people can be used for more valuable stuff globally.
Absolutely. I come from that school of thought that AI, never in our humanity have we needed less people other than business downturns and recessions. We always need more people to do the work. So AI is going to be no different. It's going to make certain roles go away, and it'll probably give birth to a certain roles that we haven't yet imagined. Like if I think about 10, 15 years ago, cybersecurity was a discussion point in Hollywood movies, and it's a $175 billion industry today. So I'm sure AI will give birth to new needs and new roles. And here again, you confirm the idea of GCC. By being in these global markets, you are tapping into more than one source of such skills.
I was attending the Holland IQ event in the summer, and they talked about an emerging gap, huge gap between demand and supply for AI talent. They also mentioned that India is being ranked as a number one country to supply AI talent over the next 10 years. I think this is an interesting data point. Ashish, is there any parting advice that you might want to leave our listeners with today?
I think one thing that to conclude, right, the message that I would have for our listeners is do this, do it now, but don't do it for the savings, which I think will come naturally. Do it for driving speed to market, excellence in operations. Make those requirements and success criteria as access to new technology and new talent pools and ecosystems. And the savings impact on your EBITDA, I think, will follow just because there is a wage arbitrage lever. I feel like companies that lead with wage arbitrage leave a lot of these additional benefits on the table as unattended or underutilized. And so, build a business case and aspirations based on the fact that you need a lot more value out of your GCC than simply the savings. And answer the most important and crucial question: why are you doing this in the first place? But Aki, I thank you for having me on and an insightful conversation. And it's already getting my head spinning a little bit with some ideas that you've planted now in my head.
Ashish, thank you very much for your time today. It was lovely to have you here, and I'm sure our listeners will find valuable insights in this podcast. I invite our listeners to send us their feedback, and if they would like to follow us with them on any further questions, meeting with Ashish, we welcome all of that. Thank you again, everyone, and thank you, Ashish.